You, thank you.
Good. Right, so morning everyone. So just to quickly introduce myself, for those who don't know me, you might know me from LROS in the past, and I've been actively recording moths in VC55 since 1999. I assisted Adrian in the background for a number of years and took on the county moth recorder role last year. So before I start, it might be useful to define what I mean by status. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the generalist terms common, local, scarce and rare that you tend to see in the field guides. But in the most formal sense, a species status refers to the level of threat it faces of risk of extinction, either completely, regionally or locally. So in 2019, Butterfly Conservation did an assessment of all the larger moth species known as the macro moths against the IUCN Red List criteria. So this used data that was gathered by the National Moth Recording Scheme, and all the macro moths are now categorized using the internationally recognized scale from regionally extinct to least concern. But obviously that's a very scientifically put together assessment. And even if a species is of least concern or common, it can still be undergoing a notable shift in abundance or distribution locally. So the species that I'm going to show briefly today can be much more simplistically categorized into three groups. So almost all of the species that I'll look at have least concern status, but in VC55, some of them are doing very well in terms of their abundance or their distribution, or even due to small changes in their life cycle. These are essentially the winners. On the other end of the scale, we have species that are declining in numbers, contracting their range, or even at risk of disappearing. And these are essentially the losers that are not responding well to changing ecological factors. The third group are those that appear to be benefiting from the changes that are affecting long-standing residents. And these are the colonists. These are species that have recently arrived in the UK, or in some instances have recolonized and are expanding their range and abundance very rapidly. There's also adventive species, and there are species that are arriving with changing migratory patterns that may well lead to future colonization. These overall patterns are of course not new, and they're certainly not restricted to Lepidoptera, but the relatively quick pace of change is a concern. So before I go on, I should be very clear, I'm not a scientist or a mathematician. The analysis I'm showing are not statistically robust. The data has not been normalized. There's no 95% confidence intervals. It's just a basic trend, but it shows a trend that matches the abundance or distribution changes reflected in the Butterfly Conservation Atlas. Whilst I record macro moths and micro moths, there's not enough data for the micros to assess them. So the focus here is on the macro moths only. I've also omitted larval data for the same reason. And finally, we've got around 570 species of macro moths recorded from VC55. I've got 15 minutes. This is going to be a very, very brief snapshot of just a few of the species to give a flavour of the changes. All of the charts that you'll see follow the same basic layout. The data up until 2010 is incomplete insofar as many recorders were only submitting species lists with no counts or dates. And where recorders were submitting detailed records, a lot of those have been collated into one record with a total count and date range for the year. So to counter this, I've plotted the number of individuals for each species as a percentage of the total number of individuals across the species by year, which is sufficient to give a basic trend of increase or decrease. So the only differences you'll see in the charts is the percentage scale on the right-hand axis, and the use of red, amber or green pertinent to the species. So the least carpet, as the name suggests, it's a very small and dainty moth. It's first recorded in the UK in 1831 in the London area, but remained localized and rare until the mid-20th century. The first VC55 records came sporadically from Rothamsted traps in Empingham, with 6 records between 1976 and 1990. No further records until 2003, and from then it started to appear in numbers until a dramatic increase from 2018, as you can see on the chart. So it's now an expected and regular moth in most garden traps. But as you can see from the Butterfly Conservation Atlas abundance change, the shift has been quite dramatic, and we're seeing that in Leicestershire as well. Silver ground carpet should be a familiar species to most recorders. It's often seen day flying, and it also comes to garden light traps. But what's not so obvious to the people recording in the gardens is that over time there's been a sustained decline in the VC55 abundance, particularly in the last decade. It's got a very generalist habitat and food plant requirement, so the fact that it overwinters as a larva may be a factor in its decline. The red-green carpet is first recorded in VC55 in the 19th century and was recorded in low numbers in the late 1980s and through the 1990s. It's been steadily increasing in abundance over the last 20 years. It's now a regular and widespread species in the county, appearing in most garden moth traps. It overwinters as an adult, so it appears in the autumn, reappears again in the spring. As you can see from the chart, it's going up pretty well. Clouded border is one of our more unmistakable moths with its distinctive monochrome pattern. It was first recorded in VC55 in the 19th century and continuously recorded through the last century. There's been a pattern of rising and falling numbers, but from around 2016, there appears to have been a sustained decline. Obviously, this is one where the chart is a bit indicative. We'll need to see more data over the next few years to see whether that decline continues. So black arches, the first modern record for VC55 came in 1981. And all the records from then until 2000 came from just two sites, Pickworth Great Wood and the adjacent Clipsham Quarry. From 2001, there was a small expansion in range, predominantly into Rutland woodlands, and that's shown by the orange dots on the map. In 2004, we had a record for Beacon Hill, and that preceded a steady and continued expansion throughout VC55, which is shown progressively by the yellow, white, red and black dots, which are approximate 5-year steps. And it's another one that's now turning up regularly in garden light traps. One that's not appearing regularly at all is garden tiger. It's a moth that would have been very familiar to former generations because of the larvae that were known as woolly bears. But it's suffered a significant decline for many years, although in VC55 it's been continuously recorded since at least 1970. But the decline since 2016 is notable, as 2022 was sadly the first year with absolutely no records. It overwinters as a small larva, and whilst we hope to see it have a bit of a bounce back, at the moment there's no indication that's going to happen. So orange footman, this is one that's doing very, very well in the counties. All of our records have occurred since 2003, with a steady and sustained increase, which mirrors the abundance change given in the atlas. And this one overwinters as a pupa and is generally the first footman to appear in garden light traps in each year. This is one of our more enigmatic species, long sought after by moth recorders, and the traditional vernacular name of Clifton nonpareil is certainly more enigmatic than the more recently coined blue underwing. There's a specimen in the collection from 1902, and there are 3 vague records from the first half of the 20th century. In the UK as a whole, it was briefly resident in Kent and the Norfolk Broads in the early 20th century, but has generally been a scarce migrant until recolonisation in southern England from around 2007. But there's been a sudden expansion in recent years. We saw our first records in 2019, where it's recorded from a remarkable 8 tetrads, and it's continued to appear in growing numbers from then. And there's no indication that it's going to disappear anytime soon. This is one that's very, very new to us as a colonist in the county. It was considered a rare migrant to the UK for many years before apparently colonising southern counties from around 2005. And then very recently, it's been spreading through north and west. We had 2 records in 2018, which were completely unexpected, but it reappeared again in 2021 and 2022. And the pattern of occurrences, both here and from neighbouring counties, suggests that it's now resident in VC55. We have records to both light traps and to pheromone traps. So the coronet is one that was recorded in the 19th century, and there were 5 records from Rutland in the 1970s, but then no further records until 2003. Small increase in numbers until around 2009, it had reached Leicester City, and from then it's become one of our commoner moths in the garden traps. The overall increase is pretty clear on the chart there. Tree-liking beauty is another former scarce migrant to the UK, but records increased from the early 1990s. From around the early 2000s, it appears to have been established in the southeast and has then recently spread quite quickly. The first VC55 records came in 2018, and it's already an expected annual visitor to garden light traps. The red, white and black dots on the map are approximate 2-year periods, just to show the spread through the counties. Now, this is another former resident in the UK. It's resident in East Anglia in the southeast of England, considered extinct in the UK by the late 1930s. There were a couple of records in Kent in 1997, and then larvae were found the following year, and that's preceded a recolonisation into the southeast, and then a dramatic and rapid spread through to the Midlands. We had our first VC55 records in 2006, and it has continued to steadily increase from there on. And again, it's another one that anyone recording in their gardens, relatively newly in the last decade, wouldn't appreciate how scarce it was. The Heart Club, it's another species doing very well at the moment. Unlike some of our colonists, this is one that would have been considered quite common in Britain. It's well distributed throughout England, Wales and Scotland. But actually in VC55, we only had 36 records between 1959 and 1999. Continued in very small numbers, or not at all most years, until around 2008. And from there on, it's increased dramatically. And the last species I'll show is the Gothic. It's one that's been continuously recorded in VC55 since at least the 1970s. And there used to be annual counts from some gardens well into double figures. But numbers have been steadily declining since 2000. And despite a slight resurgence around 2009, 2013-ish, there's been a continued decline in the last few years. It's been in single figures. Overwinters as small larvae and pupates underground in the early spring. So we need to see over the next few years whether there's any kind of resurgence again, or whether it actually disappears altogether. So there's 3 species here that are perhaps at most risk of disappearing until from VC55 altogether. So the Glaucus shears was last recorded from the Charnwood area in 2018. That's where it's been recorded continuously through a long period. The only record away from that area was unexpected and a presumed wanderer, and that was in Sapcote in 2020. But it's predominantly a moth of the north and western moorland, so the Charnwood population is at the limit of its range. And as we're seeing species move, this is one that's likely to disappear from VC55 in time. And the annulet, it's actually a coastal species in southwest England and Wales, and there are very localised inland populations on heath and moorland. In Leicestershire, It's generally been in Charnwood area, but there's been no records from there since 2007. And the last record is one in Cloudwood in 2013. Again, it's one that could disappear altogether. And the dotted rustic, this is one that was actually quite regular in VC55 from the late 70s until the mid 1990s. But the last record was in 2005. There's only been 6 records since 1999. So that's one that's very, very clearly declined. The numbers are not big enough to do a chart, but it's pretty much disappeared at the moment. On the flip side, these are 3 very recent colonists to the UK that have been spreading, sometimes appearing in numbers, and seems to be getting closer to VC55 in neighbouring counties such as Northamptonshire and Cambridgeshire, and also a bit further south in Bedfordshire. It seems to be just a matter of time before these arrive here. So the black-spotted chestnut is one that's likely to turn up in garden light traps in the winter period. It's one that overwinters as an adult. Clancy's rustic is autumnal, and oak rustic is also autumnal. So running light traps around September through till March is likely to produce one of these species. That's a very brief, quick squint through a few species. For a more in-depth and properly scientific assessment on a national level, the Butterfly Conservation Atlas is a must for anyone, a good read. But if you go on their website, following that QR link, there are a number of PDF documents which continually updated to give an indication of the status. These are 3 books I'd recommend to anybody who wants to get into moth identification. This is where I've got the food planting habitat information from that I've used. And finally, just to remind everyone that not all moths are brown and boring. These are all VC55 species. There's an email link there. If you've got the ID queries or if you want any information on VC55 moths, then please get in touch. There's also a Facebook group, which is very helpful for anyone who wants to get interested in moths. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. That